What is up, my 8 Push people? This is Mr. Winchell, wanting to first of all wish you a very successful first full week of school. I hope that you were able to ease yourself into what distance learning is going to look like, begin to get comfortable with the schedule and the logistics of it all, and now you are ready to hit the ground running with a full week of asynchronous learning, like today, as you're going to learn about the development of 13 colonies and some colonial regional identity developments, as well as some live sessions, as we're going to talk later this week together about the development of some political systems and some native conflicts. So we have a lot of really important work to get to. I want to encourage you to make sure that you have your discussion questions available in front of you, either virtually or if you're fortunate enough to have a printer printed out. I have the same handout in front of me to make sure that I am conveying the information that you need to be able to answer these important questions. But as always, once this is done, if you find yourself still confused about anything, feel free to send me a message. And I'll be happy to walk you through any of the particulars or the specifics. So let's get going. We spent time during our summer work and during last week's work talking about two important things. Thing one, what Native societies look like and how Native societies interact before and after European exploration, colonization, and exploitation. So that's really important to note as a piece of background contextualization for how today is going to be carried out, as well as important background information, the way in which the Spanish conduct their colonization, right? The French conduct their colonization, the way the Dutch conduct their colonization. College Board is going to ask you to be able to differentiate the colonial models between these different empires. So knowing, for example, that the Spanish are going to engage in much more hands-on control of their colonies. They're going to engage in the enslavement of natives. They're going to have a much broader spanning empire than the others. That's important to know. Just like it's important to know that the French are not going to do that for the most part. They're going to engage in much more amiable or friendly relationships with the natives. They're going to have far fewer colonists come to settle. Primarily, they're working to benefit from the fur trade with Native Americans. So when we say European colonization, my encouragement to you is to be able to have a conversation that's a little more nuanced than just this is what Europeans do, but rather this is what the Spanish do, this is what the British do, this is what the French do, right? Because those differences matter. So today we're going to transition, though, right? It's a really important transition into what becomes what the United States of America, which is why we spend our time on the background stuff. This is where we really get into the meat of what becomes U.S. history. And that's the development of what becomes the 13 colonies, and with it, colonial regional identity. And what that means, it's really important. It's a really important phrase for you to get your mind around to start today. Colonial regional identity. And what that means is who people are based on what region they come from. Now, this isn't going to mean that every single person in every region has the same identity, but rather some regions begin to carry an identity separate from other parts of the colonies and later other parts of the country. I think about this often today, and that we often think of the West Coast of California, Oregon, and Washington as very liberal, as much more diverse, much more leaning left politically. They're much more likely to vote Democrat. That doesn't mean that everybody in these states is a Democrat, but that does mean that these states have a regional identity of embracing more liberal philosophies. So think about it that way, right? The same thing's going to hold true for the colonies, right? We're going to have 3 very distinct regional identities, all of which we'll get ourselves into today. We'll start down at the bottom, north to southwise, with southern colonial identity. We'll call it today the Chesapeake. And then it'll branch out to the south as a whole. Then we'll go to the very top and talk about New England's colonial identity and what their society is built on and why. And then we'll meet in the middle with kind of a mixture of both north and south. That's why I'm going to do it that way, with the middle colonies. Now, I'm going to use a couple phrases that I want you to know. The first is the Atlantic seaboard. That's going to really refer to everything that's on the Atlantic coast in these 13 colonies, where much of the early story of the country is going to take place. But the rest of the important terminology I'll make sure that I get to as we go through it. And let's go ahead and get ourselves to work. So I already kind of talked about what we're doing. We're talking about the Chesapeake settlements, which will become the South. We'll talk about the New England settlements, which is the very, very tip top, the Northeast. And then we'll meet in the middle with the Middle Atlantic settlements as well. So we're pivoting ourselves directly to talk just about England, just about British colonization of this quote-unquote New World. Now, what's unique about British colonization is there's a whole bunch of different ways to get a colony. Um, English colonization is much less formalized and organized than the Spanish. The Spanish, the king and queen, the monarchy of Spain have very strict control over their colonies. In England, it's much more of the Wild West, much looser control. There's a variety of different ways you can get a colony. For example, you can get a charter, which is like permission to go get a colony from the king or queen. You can get a corporate colony, in which a bunch of individuals pool their money like into a corporation, like a big business, and they send colonists out to hopefully make money for them. If you are an individual or a group that are looking to create a unique kind of a society, like Maryland that becomes a colony for Catholic toleration, and Pennsylvania that becomes a colony for toleration as a whole, you can apply for a colony based on that principle. Or other colonies become colonies based on royal control, which looks a little more like the Spanish model of the king or queen saying, go to the colony, I'm going to appoint your governor, I'm going to tell you what to do, etc. So it's important to note that in these 13 colonies, there's variance in terms of the permission that they got to get there. And that just reflects the fact that the British don't operate from a standpoint of strict control over who's colonizing and why. So that's just good background knowledge for you. Now, by 1660, so this is going to be about, if you did your reading, which of course you did because you're great scholars, about 50 years into British colonization of North America, about 50 years in, this is really the only area that has been colonized. Is for England is the area that is in blue, okay? So if you follow my mouse, this here, I'll do it this way, pointer, this here, in Virginia is going to be the Chesapeake colonization. As you can see, it's really still, even 50 years in, confined to the Atlantic seaboard, combined to the Atlantic coast there. In this right here is the Chesapeake Bay, so this is called the Chesapeake colonies right there. We got Virginia and we got Maryland, right? And we're going to talk about both of these colonies here shortly, but I want to point out that like 50 years in, they still don't have a whole lot of territory. They're still pretty much confined and stuck there on the shore, okay? In New England, which we'll talk about afterwards, like I told you here, the northern part of British North America, again, we see that people, for the most part, they've spread out a little more, but they're still mostly confined on the Atlantic seaboard. We also see here a little bit of Spanish colonization down here in what becomes Florida. That's worth noting for later. We see some French colonization up here in what now we refer to as Canada, on the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes region. Again, they're working for that fur trade we talked about. And then we also see the Netherlands, or the Dutch, right? And they're going to be controlling now what we know as New York, as well as a little chunk of Delaware. So it's not just that this area is only British, it just eventually becomes only British. Get my face back for you there. So this is what it looks like 50 years in, and I want this this map there here to help you understand that this process unfolds very slowly. That we start with, 120 people, and then they almost all die, and then 200 more show up, and then they almost all die. All right, and this process is slow going in creating successful settlements, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from your mother country. So these will be eventually, by 1763, this is what it looks like. So 100 years later, it's much more robust. It's much more developed. We have our New England colonies that have now developed into be Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Right, this whole chunk of northeastern now is the United States. We have our middle colonies right here in the middle. There you go. The big ones are New York and Pennsylvania, but New Jersey and Delaware are going to apply there as well. And then everything from Maryland on down will be considered the South. With this considered like the upper South or the Chesapeake, and these considered the lower South or the deep South, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. So each of these regions, to my point earlier, each of these regions is going to have its own unique set of characteristics, of qualities, of economic priorities, of social priorities, of political aspirations. And they're not really going to see themselves as one collective unit as Americans for a very, very long time. Even into the American Revolutionary War, which we'll talk about next unit. people still, for the most part, refer to themselves by what state or what colony they're from. Right? So they'd say like I'm a Virginian, right? Or I'm a New Englander for that whole New England region, or I'm a New Yorker, or I'm a South Carolinian from South Carolina. It's not till much later that we start talking about what an American identity looks like that people start referring to themselves as Americans. So again, this is just to point out to you that this process unfolds very slowly, which is one of the reasons why there's so much nuance and complexity for us to study. Now, first, let's talk about this. Before we even talk about who's here, let's talk about what's here. Okay. So we see from a land standpoint, we see that from the Chesapeake or Middle Colonies on south, it's much more of a coastal plain, meaning it's flat and rich soil. Whereas in New England, we see that it's rocky hills. I don't know much about farming, but I know that farming where it's rocky is probably not the best of ideas. We see that the New England area also jumps right from hills to this yellow chunk, which is mountains, whereas the mountains in the south and middle colonies are further inland. So that can be helpful for us to figure out kind of what they're going to do once people get there. We look down here to just what the soil looks like. What's the composition of the soil? In the whole of these southern colonies and middle colonies, they have the most fertile of soils, with a small chunk down here of at least moderately fertile soil. Whereas in New England, their soil is much less fertile, meaning it's much more difficult, much more challenging to sustain yourself on farming. Okay? So we talk about what the land looks like, what the soil looks like. Let's talk about the growing season, which means how long during the year are you able or capable of growing large-scale crops. Down here in Florida, what becomes Florida and the South Carolina and Georgia coast, we see that they have a growing season that's from 9 to 12 months, so nearly year-round. But then the whole rest of the southern colonies, they have a growing season that's 7 to 9 months long, which means for much of the year they can be growing whatever crop it is they choose to grow. Whereas in the middle colonies and the New England colonies, it is much less so. A 5 to 7 month growing window, or further north, a 3 to 5 month growing window. So my first question that I want you to stop, pause, and answer is look at these geographic differences. Look at these differences, just not even about who's there or what they're doing, but in what is there in this Atlantic seaboard colonial area. What differences exist is the first question for you, and then what might that lead to? All right, think just critically about what's there, and then what might that contribute to in terms of the development of these regional characteristics. Meaning, right, if you were going to go settle in these southern colonies, what might you do to be successful, to make money, versus what might you do if you are living in New England? Right? Those differences matter. So feel free to pause if you need to. Jot down some thoughts. I don't expect full, complete sentences. This is like your lecture notes. So just know that you're dropping bullet points in. You're making sure that you have all your notes. You're going to work from these documents later to make sure you can access our assessments and the like. Okay, so that's our geographic snapshot. We're going to start with the Chesapeake. Okay, so if I go back, we're going to start right in here in this Chesapeake Bay. And this is this water inlet from the Atlantic Ocean. Right, it drops right in there. And they settled on this area because they figured that it would be easy to defend against foreign invaders, right? So they're worried about who's coming from out here, from the ocean. They're worried about the Spanish. They're worried about maybe the French. They're worried about whoever else might come invade them. So they set up shop on this bluff here up against the water so they can defend themselves against what's out here without even stopping to consider about defending themselves against what's in here, which, as you all know, are Native Americans and a bunch of other terrible things like disease and the like. So that's where they set up shop and why here in the Chesapeake, which is where we're going to start this story. Now, they're going to go to a place called Jamestown. All right. Of course, it's named for King James. Imagine being so vain, so into yourself that people keep naming things after you everywhere they go. It would be annoying to me. It's not the first time that the British have tried to colonize North America. Before Jamestown, the British tried a small place called Roanoke. They showed up. They dropped all these people off. People went back. The next year, another group came with supplies, and everybody was gone. Not like dead, buried, just gone. So after that failure, that's kind of scary and terrifying, the British are like, yeah, why don't we not try this whole colonization thing? Maybe we don't need to go send people to just go disappear on islands in the freaking Atlantic Ocean. So there's little interest in colonization in America from the British, even though the Spanish are doing it successfully. The French and the Dutch are doing it successfully, but differently, but successfully. The Dutch are doing it successfully. The Portuguese in South America are doing it successfully. The British are much more hesitant to do so. But there are still important influences like Richard Hakluyt, who you read this summer, which is why you read it this summer. Richard Hakluyt, who is influential in Great Britain, and he's pushing and pushing and pushing and saying, no. We need to be colonizing. We can't fall behind. We can get, if we put up successful colonies, we can get our country rich. We can get individuals rich. We can keep up in this international competition situation with the Spanish, with the Dutch, with the French. We need to keep up. We need to push for national pride. Additionally, there's going to be a pretty important theme throughout American history. If we let the Spanish conquer everything, then they're going to spread Catholicism to the whole world. And there is in Great Britain a significant amount of anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish perspective. So there's this fear, right, that the Spanish are doing something that we can't do, and we're falling behind, and they're going to take over the world, and we're going to have nothing left. So with that in mind, the biggest problem for British colonization, the biggest thing to overcome, the biggest obstacle is money. It's expensive, right? To load up ships, to build ships, to send people off, to try to supply them. These things are expensive. And money is the big obstacle because Queen Elizabeth at the time refuses to spend tax money. She's like, I'm not spending people's hard-earned tax money. They're paying taxes to the government to go send some people off to the middle of nowhere to hope that a colony might be successful. So this is different than the Spanish because the Spanish are royally funding their colonies. The government's the one saying, go, go, go. In this case, Queen Elizabeth and then later King James, they're going to say, like, go if you want, but we're not paying for it, and you're kind of on your own. So the solution to this problem is what becomes known as joint stock companies. Joint stock companies is a really important early form of a corporation in America. And what that means is, let's think about it together, right? Here we are in class. I don't have all that much money. I don't know how much money you have. You probably don't have all that much money. Right? You're a teenager. So none of us by ourselves could pay for a new colony. But what if we all put our money together, right? And then we had enough money for a colony, right? Congratulations, we just formed a corporation. Right? Now we all pooled our money, we pooled our resources, which means that when and if this colony is successful, then we'll all share the profits from it. Okay, this joint stock company is going to be the first thing that creates the financing or the money available for the colonies. But think about this. If you and I all put our money in for these colonies, what are we expecting back? What are we hoping comes back to us? Money. Right? We put our money in, we'd like some money back. So these early colonies aren't necessarily about like establishing a stable society or working for equality or the common good. They're about how are we going to get money so we can pay back the people that sent us here. Okay, so 1606 is a big year. King James gives what becomes this first joint stock company, the London Company. They get the first charter meaning permission, the first document that says, go for it, you go establish some colonies in America. And here they are advertising. Come, get on this boat. Doesn't it look awesome? I'm down. Offering the most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia. The most excellent fruits. I mean, I'm down if you're down to go over to Virginia and find ourselves some most excellent fruits. And it's going to be exciting. That's what it says. It's exciting. As such, as will be affected to further the fame. We're going to get famous. We're going to get rich. We're going to get some excellent fruits. We're going to be good to go. This London Company is later going to be named the Virginia Company because they're going to settle in Virginia. But like I told you a minute ago, because the stockholders, people that put their money in England, they put all their money in, they're expecting instant profits. They're expecting to get money back quickly, right? Put our money in, we want to get some money back. It's kind of the way it works. So Jamestown is the first successful settlement in British North America. Very important. It's very important of these turning point years. We're going to learn a lot of this year. 1607. Really, it's the beginning of the story. Okay. So 1607 is the year. They settle along the Chesapeake Bay, like I've told you. The location they pick is incredibly unhealthy and incredibly dumb. But the reason they pick it is to defend themselves from Spanish ships, not realizing the real thing they're going to need to defend against are the Native Americans that are set up behind them. A couple problems that I think are, of course, worth noting. One, the settlers have zero experience founding a settlement. Nobody's done this before. How do you show up in an undeveloped land and say, boom, we're here to get rich. Let's go. Okay, now what? Are we going to find gold? Maybe. No. But what do we do if we don't find gold? How are we going to create a profitable settlement here with no experience and no foresight and no thinking about what you're going to do? These colonists all expect to show up and become immediately wealthy. Why? Because that's a lot of what happened for the Spanish, right? They're finding much more gold in Central America and modern-day Mexico. They are, because of their caste system that we've already talked about, able to exploit native labor. The British aren't set up to do any of this. The colonists expect to just show up and become wealthy, and they have zero long-term society building plans, right? It's like if Multis and I just went to the forest and we're like, all right, we didn't show up with a tent or a shovel or a stove, but we're going to get rich. Like, no, we're not. We're going to die in the woods, right? It's not a good idea. So because there's no plan or preparation for long-term success, the beginning of this story is a freaking nightmare, all right? Because all these individuals are there to get rich. If you're there to get rich, are you looking out for the people that are there with you, or are you looking out for yourself? You're looking out for yourself because, by its very nature, the idea of I'm going to get rich is a very selfish type of life motivation. So these colonists, because of why they went there, they don't work for the common good, and as a result, many of them starve to death. Right? The big idea here, as you see in your notes, is that why you go somewhere. It's a really big, important theme for the entire year. Why you go somewhere impacts what you do when you get there. Why did settlers go to Virginia? To get rich. Therefore, what did they do when they got there? They tried to get rich. And again, when you're in a brand new world, so to speak, there needs to be some semblance of community, of coming together, of working for the good of all in order for everybody to be successful, and that's not at all what happens in Virginia. Big, big mess. This early time is called the starving time. Why? Because everybody starves. One of the things I love about APUSH is most things are very appropriately named, meaning, man, 80% of our settlers starved to death. What should we call this time in history? How about the starving time? All right, sounds good. Let's do it. So the early part of the story is very, very ugly. 1 year in, John Smith is going to show up and at least provide some leadership in Jamestown to start building some sort of a society. Start trading for food with the natives by providing some trinkets and odds and ends manufactured goods from England to at least have food so people aren't starving anymore. But Jamestown faces enormous difficulties. The leadership is poor. The winters are really hard. Everything from 1607 to 1610 is really just a nightmare. Once they begin to become a little more successful and a little more stable, that means more people are going to come once you have more of a stable settlement, a stable colony. When more people come, people need to spread out. When people spread out, who does that upset? That upsets the natives. So even when they become a little more successful, that then leads to more conflict because their success leads to spreading out into native territory. So 1622 and 1644, the colony has significant wars with the Powhatan Indian tribe. So moral of the story, it's not a very promising or optimistic start to the conversation. There's John Smith looking dope, cool little beard. If you're a Dodger fan, I think he looks a little bit like Justin Turner. But here we are. And this Powhatan tribe is important because they are one of the most powerful Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River. So they're a big confederacy, very powerful. And of course, where do these Jamestown settlers settle? Right in the middle of their entire empire. So again, poor planning, poor execution. I want to stop you for a second here, and I want you to look at this depiction. I want you to look at this depiction of one of the Powhatan uprisings, and let's talk about it. Think when you see something like this, think to yourself a couple things, because we're going to see a whole lot of images, a whole lot of visuals. This is an example of propaganda this school year. Who is drawing this, and why? So think about that for a second for me. Who is drawing this, and what are they trying to get across? What message are they trying to push? What are they trying to get across to their viewer? Because it's important. Now, when I look at this, I see, man, it looks like the Native Americans are way outnumbering the white people. Right? That's the first thing I see. There's way more natives than there are white people, and we see more natives showing up in their canoes, uh, presumably to also join in this attack. Okay, that's the first thing I see. Second thing I see is, man, these white people, they were just having breakfast. Like, man, they were just there, minding their own business, doing their own thing, chilling. And then these natives just showed up with knives and clubs, and they beat the hell out of everybody. What savages. Now we're getting closer to what this cartoon or propaganda is trying to make us think. Next thing I think is, why are these Native Americans all like 9 feet tall? These are the most massive humans ever. All right, like I go to the gym as much as I possibly can. Not now because everything's closed, but I love going to the gym, and I look nothing like this shirtless Native man. Nor will I probably ever look anything like this shirtless Native man. Like, what is this guy doing? What kind of protein powder is he on? Because he is jacked. And I'm a little bit jealous, to be honest. So when you look at this and we see that this guy is attacking a woman and a child, oh my goodness, we got this woman and child that are obviously about to get clubbed in the head. We have to ask ourselves, like, man, is this an accurate depiction of what happened? Or is this artist trying to display for the audience that Native Americans are savages and thus anything we do to get them out of our way is justified? Okay? So you always have to think through for any source, any text, whether it be visual or written or anything, like, what message is this trying to send and why? So in this case, this is meant to make white people in America and England feel better about the way they're about to treat Native Americans, which we're going to explore in this week's document analysis for our live session, either tomorrow or Thursday. This becomes kind of the justifying factor for what becomes the beginning of Native American genocide in consistently pushing, slaughtering, and removing Native Americans from the Atlantic seaboard and then from the interior of America because of this perspective that Native Americans are savage beasts and therefore whatever we do to them, like, they deserved. Okay? So very important image because it shows us an early example of propaganda that perpetuates this idea that white people in America are in the right and Native Americans are savage beasts that should be dealt with. Okay? So the thing that ends up actually saving Jamestown and with it Virginia is what at the time is referred to as a stinking weed. King James hates tobacco. He thinks it's terrible. It smells awful. He's not a fan. But a man named John Rolfe, who, as you see here, is a freaking OG. Look at that guy's outfit. Like, sign me up. Maybe I'll do that for Halloween if they'll let us back into the school. John Rolfe introduces a specific hybrid plant of tobacco that ends up being enormously successful in Jamestown. The climate is perfect for tobacco. The soil is perfect for tobacco. The long growing condition is perfect for tobacco. So very quickly, Jamestown becomes a cash crop economy, meaning that everybody isn't necessarily farming for their own good. They're not farming all the things they need to have, to eat, to trade, to that. Everybody's farming as much tobacco as possible because that is the cash crop, that is the staple or the foundation for their colonial economy. Jamestown and tobacco ends up setting a very important precedent for the way the rest of the South is going to develop economically and socially. And the way I like to phrase this is that the colonists came looking for gold, and they, of course, did not find gold. But tobacco becomes their gold. Tobacco becomes their way to create a get-rich-based society in a way that builds the rest of their social structures out going forward. Okay? So this stinking weed is going to require a couple things. Right? If you're going to have if you're going to farm tobacco, you need pretty much two things. Two things. You need land, because it takes up a lot of space, and you need labor. You need land and you need labor, okay? So the way in which we're going to solve both of those problems is the head-right system, okay? And what that means is that if you have a little bit of money and you live in England, right, you can come to Virginia, you can come to Jamestown, you can come to the Virginia colony, and we will give you 50 acres of land. That's a lot of land. 50 acres is a massive amount of land. We'll give you 50 acres of land if you pay your own way to come here to Virginia. All right, and you can farm as much tobacco as you want. Of course, this land is still forested. You have to cut down the trees and do all this work. But once you do this work, I mean, it's a pretty good deal. 50 free acres of land. We're going to give you 50 acres of land. And for every laborer, we're going to call them indentured servants. Every indentured servant you bring with you, we'll give you 50 more acres of land. Meaning if I come and I bring 10 servants with me, not slaves yet, these are white, really lower class people that live in England that are maybe former criminals, that are homeless, that are at the bottom of the social structure, so they have no real means of upward mobility in England. So this kind of option sounds attractive to them because it's better than nothing. If I bring myself and 10 indentured servants with me, that means I get 10 times 50 is 500 plus 50 more from me, 550 acres of free land. That's crazy. That's the head-right system. Very, very important. But what that means is that anybody who can afford to, so reasonably wealthy people, or maybe middle-class people that know they're never going to get rich in England, but they want to get rich somewhere, reasonably wealthy people can come to Virginia and gather up all the good land for themselves simply by paying for the transportation of their servants. Right? And that solves both problems because you have these servants that you brought over to work the land, that's your labor solution, and you have the land because of the head-right system, that's your land solution. So the head-right system really solves both those problems, but it leads to huge tobacco plantations in which the rich that already started off a little bit ahead are then able to create a system in which they have gathered up all the good land, all the good resources, and they have the labor. So it leads to Virginia having a ton of huge tobacco plantation and a bunch of settlers that are going to make their fortune. So you might be asking, like, these indentured servants, what's their deal? Like, why would they come all the way across the ocean to go work for somebody else? That doesn't sound very good. Virginia's growth specifically is largely due to the head-right system. As we see England having a huge amount of colonization here to New England, more to Chesapeake, and even more to the West Indies. So you may be asking yourself, sorry about that, let me get here. What's up with the head-right system? Well, these indentured servants, like, why would they sign up to go work for somebody else all the way across the ocean? Now, in general, these are people that don't have a lot of options in life. And then from their perspective, like, they're going to come across the ocean. They're going to work for 5 to 7 years. And then once they serve their term of contract, their indentured servitude contract, they're free. And once they're free, they're given land. That sounds awesome because you can never get land in England because it's a small island and laws of primogeniture mean land is only passed down to the firstborn son. And England's overcrowded. So, in the 17th century, land means freedom and opportunity. So here's a chance to get land. You come to America, you work 5 to 7 years, and then you're free and you get land. But think back to that earlier problem. Where's this land going to be? If all the people that came first and brought all these servants get all these thousands of acres of land, then when you get free in 5 to 7 years, where's your land about to be? Like way out there where it's undeveloped, there's probably more native conflict. It's going to be harder to make money. Maybe the soil's not going to be as good because we're getting closer and closer to the mountains that are out there. But nobody thinks that far ahead yet. We're not there. But the idea that maybe I can get some land is a very attractive idea. They're promised freedom dues and land after their terms. They're not allowed to get married while they're indentured servants. But here's the math on it, right? The first 5 years of the system, only 1 out of 10 of these servants even outlived their contracts, even lived long enough to become free. So the system, in theory, is a win-win because it allows people in England a chance for like a second chance at life and success, and it allows the landowners to provide some labor to work on their farms. But in reality, it ends up being kind of awful. So 1619, we're 12 years in. 1619 is a really, really, really big turning point year, a big turning point year. And one of the reasons is a very good reason, and one of the reasons is a very ugly reason. But both of them are vital in understanding the way in which the colonies developed. So 1619, the colonists in Virginia are going to create the first legislative assembly, the first real like democratic form of government, in which these colonists are going to pick their leaders. Their leaders are going to rule. They're going to pass taxes. They're going to oversee finances. They're going to pass laws, uh, and and what that means is it's going to be a very localized form of government, meaning that uh, the colonists aren't having to rely on England far away for their policies, but they can instead make their policies close to home in their local colonial assembly. They become known as the Virginia House of Burgesses. The Virginia House of Burgesses was right there on the slide for you. And that's the first legislative assembly in America. Vital understanding because we still rely on our legislative assemblies all over our country. We have a city council. That's a legislative assembly. We have a state assembly for California. We have the U.S. government, which has two legislative assemblies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So this idea of people electing people to go make rules for them has roots in America all the way back as far as 1619. So that's cool. Also in 1619, though, the first African slaves arrive in British North America. It's only about a dozen. The first sale of slaves in America, they come from a Dutch trading ship. But by the end of the 17th century, so the next 80 years, we're looking at 1,000 slaves coming to the New World a year. The next century, there becomes approximately 5.5 million slaves in America. And by 1860, the year the Civil War begins, in which America fights a war to both end and perpetuate slavery, which we'll get to in period 5. By then, 11 million slaves were brought to the New World. So the slave trade, just like colonization, starts very slowly and then accelerates over time. So a big turning point for both democracy and slavery. So that's Virginia. Those are the things you should know. You should know tobacco. You should know the headright system and indentured servitude. You should know 1619 for the House of Burgesses and the first slaves. The second Chesapeake colony is Maryland. Maryland's a little different. Maryland's not quite as consequential to our story that Virginia is. It becomes originally as a refuge, a place to go to be safe for English Catholics. The Catholics are not welcome in England, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. So this man, Lord Baltimore, creates this refuge so that English Catholics can come to Maryland. By 1632, not a lot of English Catholics have come to Maryland. So Maryland passes the Maryland Act of Toleration, which is very important and should play a role in your notes as well. You should note the Maryland Act of Toleration, which is the first example of legislation passed in what becomes America that's tolerant of different kinds of religion. Really, the only two elements of religion that it's tolerant of is Protestantism and Catholicism. It's not really all-inclusive, but it is an example of early forms of religious toleration, which is important. Now, wealthy Catholics don't come to Maryland, and that's because, for the most part, not always in society, but for the most part, rich people don't migrate. Right? If you have money, you're going to stay where you are because you're successful where you are. So these wealthy Catholics don't come, which means that Maryland is really populated instead with poor Protestant farmers, a couple Catholics, and some indentured servitude. So it becomes really like a poorer version of Virginia with a couple Catholics. So their goal as making this beautiful Catholic settlement for all these Catholics from England to come doesn't happen because rich people don't migrate. So they have some tobacco, but fewer large plantations. Some success, but not quite as much economic success as Virginia. And it's much more scattered riverfront settlements there in Maryland. So all told, what I want to stress to you is this what grows out of Jamestown, right there on the map right there. I'll get my little pointer back. What grows out of Jamestown is an entire society that's built on that same ideology that they came with. That ideology that says, I came to get rich, so I am going to do what it takes to get rich. And notice I said the word I twice. It's the characteristics that I want you to note, very individualistic, meaning people are looking out for what's good for them. The economy and society is much less urban, right? There's not a whole lot of cities because the head right system leads to people spreading out and taking much more space. So there's less interconnectivity like cities because the land is so good for agriculture. And that's because of the head right system. In the coastal regions, on the Atlantic seaboard, their economies are going to be very, very cash crop based, cash crop economies, and we see that right here from North Carolina up is going to be based on tobacco. Down here in the lower south, we're going to see much more based on indigo, which is like a dye, and rice on the coast as well. But in these cash crop economies, it's important to know that everything revolves around that everyone's trying to get as much land as possible so they can grow that specific cash crop. Right? Most of the money, most of the big plantations where people are getting rich are closer to the sea, closer to the Atlantic seaboard, because the soil is better and access to trading it out to Europe is better. Inland, the farther away from the ocean elements, much more small-scale subsistence farming, which means like small farmers trying to farm enough to get by for themselves. Some hunting, some trading, less cash crop agriculture. And that's going to create a divide that we'll see going forward for much of the society. Is the division between the rich and the poor. In this case, in the South, from like the seaboard where the plantations are to inland. Like I told you, there's this strong belief in individualism, private ownership of property, and free enterprise, meaning like the willingness to do things for yourself throughout these southern colonial colonies in 1750. So that's the South. There's obviously more to know than that, but we'll dive into that during our discussions live this week. I covered that then for you. We talked about all these colonies. We're going to zoom way up north to New England in the yellow colors here. If you have a hard time remembering what goes in what order, the middle is in the middle. That's the way it works. And the New England colonies, NE, you can use the acronym as well, Northeast, because as you can see here, they're in the northeastern part of the American colonies. So they're going to be a little different, right? And again, I asked you, big idea, why you go somewhere impacts what you do when you get there. So in the year 1620, 102 people are going to show up right up here in Massachusetts, right there. They're going to show up on a boat called the Mayflower. Right? Half these people are going to be referred to as separatists, and half of them are going to be referred to as Puritans. Now, separatists and Puritans are both dealing with the Church of England. Separatists want to leave the church entirely because they think it's gone too in a not positive direction, whereas Puritans want to stay in the Church of England, but purify it or fix the flaws from the inside. So those are the names that come from. One wants to separate, one wants to purify what they have, but both of them, which you can see they have in common, is they have a problem with the Church of England. And they want to do things a different way religiously. It's important. Right? They refuse to worship in the Anglican Church or the Church of England as it is currently set up. First, they leave to go to Holland. They realize in Holland they're going to have to comply with Holland society as well. So instead, they come to America because they want to make sure that they can create their own distinct identity and create a perfect religious society, right? If they're leaving the Church of England because the Church of England is not good enough, then they need to go somewhere where they can make it good enough, so to speak. They first hit up the Virginia Company, which, as you guys know, is down in Virginia doing their thing, planting tobacco, having some House of Burgesses, political discussions, importing some slaves, doing tobacco things. They first asked Virginia, like, hey, can we come and like create our own little settlement within where you have control? And Virginia's like, yeah, come on down. Cool, sounds good. We'll see you in about 6 months. But instead, where they land is way further north than where Virginia has control, way outside the domain of the control of Virginia Company. But they just stay anyway. They're like, you know what? We came all this way. This land seems fine. Like, I'm not really trying to go all the way down to the south. Might as well just stay here. So they do. In a sense, they become squatters with no legal right to the land. They have no authority to establish a government. England didn't send them to make a brand new colony. England sent them, well, they came not from England and send them anywhere. They just left. But they don't have permission or the ability to create a brand new colony, but they just do kind of anyway. But what they do on the boat is really important. They sign what's called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact. And it's going to be separate than what we see in Virginia. Because it's going to use the word we a whole lot, whereas Virginia was much more driven by the ideas of I, me. Mayflower Compact is going to agree that we're going to govern ourselves. We're going to do what's best for not me, but we're going to do what's best for the general good, for what's good for society as a whole. And they're going to acknowledge in the Mayflower Compact that sometimes that means that some people are going to have to sacrifice what they want for what's the good of the whole. So again, why you go somewhere impacts what it is you do when you get there. They're working to create a unified society built on very religious, strong, strict ideals. So they're going to operate a little bit differently than what we see in Virginia. One thing they have in common is they're both going to create legislative assemblies that are going to self-govern themselves, but with slightly different priorities. And because of why they go somewhere, what they do when they get there, they're going to establish this ideology of the covenant theology. And what a covenant is, religiously speaking, is it's an agreement, either between members of a community or between individuals and their God. So they're going to really build their society on this covenant theology, these agreements, so to speak. And they're going to establish a couple communities. One, the covenant of grace between these communities and God, which means in their mind that they're going to live a godly life and then God will bless them. They're going to create social covenants or social agreements amongst each other, right? Which creates the idea of mutual watchfulness, which means like I'm going to be on my best godly behavior, you're going to be on your best godly behavior, and we're going to watch each other to make sure that we're all on our best godly behavior. So this mutual watchfulness is going to establish a society of like really strict uniformity, right? If you're not staying in line, your neighbor's going to call you out for not being the proper Christian you said you were going to be. All right, because of this, we're going to see very, very, very minimal toleration of any disorder, any disagreement, any deviance or acts that are seen as counter to God's will. So the society is built on like togetherness, but it's built on like togetherness, like meaning we're all believing the same, acting the same, practicing the same type of religious practices. And because of that, then there's no privacy, because everybody is so worried that somebody's acting up and not following the laws and acts of God that everybody's very, very watchful of each other. So as you can see, we're already setting up a society that's very different than what's happening down in the South. So they're there for 9 years before they get a royal charter, permission from England to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And once they do, we see a bunch of people coming, right? Because other people agree with them that a perfect utopian society built on these religious practices is attractive. So we see a lot of people going to the Chesapeake to get rich, and we see a lot of people going to Massachusetts to practice this religious type of society. 1630, 1,000 people show up, set off in 11 well-stocked ships, and they're going to help supplement these Puritans in the first place that showed up in 1620. So they establish a much more formalized colony with Boston as the hub, the main city in the middle of it. And the 1630s is going to see a significant migration of British Puritans who are leaving England to go to Massachusetts and join this society. There's a whole bunch of turmoil in England at the time, eventually leading to the English Civil War, which means that approximately 70,000 Puritans are going to come to America and settle mostly in Massachusetts and the surrounding areas. So a lot of people go into Virginia, a lot of people go to Massachusetts for very different reasons. Now, we talked about John Rolfe as important in the Jamestown story because of tobacco. We talked about John Smith as important for providing leadership. Now we have a third freaking John, and it's the first hour of A-Push. My God. White people have no creativity with our names. It's terrible sometimes. It's true. Third John, John Winthrop. And he, of course, is going to be a very significant religious and political leader in Massachusetts. He's well off in the first place. He becomes the first governor of Massachusetts. He comes to Massachusetts because he believes that he has a calling from God to go lead there, to show these people what godly life looks like. And he's actually going to pretty much be in charge of Massachusetts for the next almost 20 years, for 19 years. Very influential. He looks like this. Freaking awesome. I want that collar. But he does he not look in this picture like he's judging you? Because that's what they do in Massachusetts, right? They judge. Look at that guy. He's looking at you like, not godly enough. You're about to go to hell. Mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm-mm. God's watching and so am I. John went through it. And he brings this ideology that's very, very, very important. And it's this called the City on a Hill ideology. And it's a document that we'll dive into this week during our discussion. But I want to preface that discussion later with this understanding that when you establish a society that's like city on a hill-esque, what that means is that you're above everybody else, but also that everybody else can see you because you're up on this hill, right? They're not actually on a hill, okay? They're actually quite close to the water. No hills are involved. But they're going to establish a society that is seen as a city on a hill. It's a metaphor, if you will. And that means that we have to create this perfect society because the whole world is watching. If we left England because their church system wasn't good enough, then we owe it to the world to do better than that. Right? To show them why we left by creating a much more perfect society of Christians. Winthrop emphasizes this common spiritual goal to become a beacon or a light of righteousness for the whole world to look at and say, that's the example. That's what it looks like to have a community built on Christian values. Right? So New England's going to be much more unique than Virginia in its demographic trends. Virginia is going to have mostly individuals and men coming, whereas in New England, settlers are going to come as families because for religious reasons they're going to migrate their whole family there. Because of this common good approach of looking out for each other, what each other needs, and building community, New England is a much healthier place to live than anywhere else in the colonies. Most settlers are going to sacrifice what they want for what's good for the community as a whole. So very, very unique little perfect utopia they build there in Massachusetts. Also, people live for a freaking long time in New England, especially considering this is 400 years ago. Right? The average life expectancy is about 70 years, which is old. Right? I'm not trying to live that long. That's a long time. 70 years old. Many people live with extended families. Cool thing way to remember this is the New England settlement really invents grandparents because it's the first place in the world where people are living long enough to have a role in their children's lives. So the New England society is so healthy and successful in this way that people are living long enough to have grandkids, which is kind of cool. Average family in New England has about 6 kids. And people actually get married a little later in New England. But women get married at about 22, which is older for society as a whole at this time. Men get married at about 27. And as you can see, it's a pretty healthy, stable society. Why? Because why they went there in the first place was to establish community and common ground, right? Maybe yes or no for ideals we believe in or we agree with. But we're not here to judge that. We're here to assess why they're a little more successful in this demographic way than elsewhere, and that is why. So Massachusetts grows far beyond Boston. Each of these little towns that spreads out and spreads out and spreads out is going to be independently governed. Each town kind of runs itself, right? This town government, that town government, this town government. And who's governing the people in Massachusetts? It is the local church members. Local church members, which is different than what happens in Virginia, which is local landowners who are making the decisions, right? Money versus church. We see that then in their social system, now in their political system as well. Massachusetts is unique in that all adult male church members can vote. Women and free blacks can join the church, but they don't have voting rights. And unlike in Virginia, officials, these colonial leaders, they're not responsible to the people that voted for them. They're not responsible to their people. They're called their constituents. They're responsible to what God wants. Okay? So again, slightly different. We'll talk about this in our live session as well, about how the political systems are similar, but also quite different between Virginia and New England. Now, these town assemblies are quite autonomous, meaning they can kind of do their own thing, make their own policies. And because almost everybody in Massachusetts is practicing the same religion, therefore they're part of the same church, they can participate politically because the entrance fee, so to speak, to engage in politics in Massachusetts is church membership. Massachusetts Bay is much more peaceful than their colonies. Why? Because they have a very uniform, unified type of society. Everybody's there for the same reason, so there's far less conflict. They create courts to maintain order, to mediate differences. They create a really balanced, stable type of society in Massachusetts. It's really quite impressive. So from a characteristic standpoint, told you, low mortality, extended families, 6 kids per family. But they're not going to have nearly as much native conflict in New England because epidemics are especially dangerous in New England because of so many more people come and they're more packed in that by the mid 1600s, 3/4 of the native population is wiped out due to disease. And then I also ask you to identify some of the other pieces of their colonies. Keep in mind they're not going to be able to farm cash crops because they don't have the soil or the growing season, or they don't really want to spread out that much, right? Because they're more about building community and having towns. So the New England colonies are going to be, economically speaking, going to rely on a couple things that I want you to know. First, timber. A lot of trees, a lot of forests, so they're going to chop down these trees and sell the wood. A lot of fishing. A lot of shipbuilding. With these, they have all this wood, might as well make some ships and sell ships. They're going to make and sell a lot of rum. There's some early manufacturing of iron and iron ore, as well as whaling. And then, of course, there is some farming, cattle and grain farming, and some beaver fur harvesting. But in general, the economy is much more built on trade, on lumber, on fishing, on commerce. Okay. Now, what happens if you live in Massachusetts, but you don't like their religious practices? What do you think? Turns out, because there's such a uniform society, if you live in Massachusetts and don't like their religious practices, you don't live in Massachusetts for very long. I have 2 really good examples for you that I want you to know both of. The first is Roger Williams. Roger Williams is a very important name. He wants to leave the Church of England altogether. So he's considered more of a separatist than a Puritan. And that's not why he gets in big trouble. He gets in big trouble because he says Massachusetts Bay, our charter, goes against God's law. Because God's law says that stealing is wrong, and we straight up stole this land from Native Americans without paying for it. So we are sitting here in violation of God's law. All right? Strike one. I tend to agree with Roger Williams that is a good point according to God's law, but the powers that be seem to disagree with him. That's one. 2, he says, philosophically speaking, how can a civil government, how can a political body regulate religious behavior? He's like, we should have 2. We should have a church and we should have a political system, but it should not be the same thing. Because in his thinking, having a political system regulating what people's religious practices are is a violation of what becomes Enlightenment ideals of like the separation of church and state. Pretty decent idea. I think it's, what if our government now told us like you have to be in church on Sunday, and if you're not, we're going to fine you like that? What if I sleep in? I don't want to get fined for that. So he ends up getting found guilty in the courts of Massachusetts of preaching dangerous opinions, preaching dangerous ideas. And what do? They kick him out. You got to go. Beat it, my man. So he leaves, and he founds a new colony of Rhode Island, which is next to Massachusetts, a little bit south, still in the New England region of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island ends up being really a religious haven for people that are dissenters, that disagree with the uniform way of doing things in Massachusetts. The Puritans had wanted to exile him all the way to England, to kick him out all the way to England, because that would keep him from founding a competing colony to compete with them for people. They're unsuccessful. He manages to go and forms Rhode Island. And there ends up being, because of his ideals, why he went there. Why did he go to Rhode Island? Because he got kicked out from disagreeing. Therefore, what does he do when he gets there? He creates a society that is much more liberal, much more open-minded, because of why he went there. Again, there's that point again. Remarkable political freedom in Providence. It's the first time we see the idea of universal male suffrage, which meaning all men that are in Rhode Island can vote. Later, they're going to add a property requirement. But Roger Williams and those in Rhode Island are going to be opposed to special privilege of any kind. Very big on freedom of opportunity. So Rhode Island, funny enough, to the other Puritans in Massachusetts, Rhode Island becomes known as the sewer colony, because it's seen as the dumping ground for all the people that aren't perfect Christians in Massachusetts, they get dumped out to Rhode Island. Because of that, because of who's going there, it's much more liberal, much more open-minded than any other colony, except maybe Pennsylvania. Next example, other than Roger Williams, is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is another awesome individual in society to learn from. She is an intelligent, strong-willed, and well-spoken woman. And society can see that as quite dangerous because she's strong, she doesn't want to shut up, and she has a lot to say. And what she has to say is pretty good. Therefore, her ideology is very threatening of patriarchal or male-dominated control in society. Her argument is this covenant theology that our whole society is built on is way too based on our acts, on what we're doing when people are watching, and not based on our faith, which is what we believe when nobody's watching. And she thinks that that kind of goes against what God preaches, that it is your faith that saves you, it is what you believe that saves you, not what you do when people are looking at you. Therefore, like this whole covenant theology, everybody watching each other is actually not doing us any good in God's eyes, in her mind. And she thought that a holy life, that living a good life, is no sure sign of being saved, of going to heaven. Rather, it's your faith, what's in your heart, what you believe that gets you there. And she's going to practice an idea called antinomianism, which is basically going to say, like, morality, what we all think is right, is socially established, right? It has nothing to do with what God thinks is right. So I don't need to listen to your laws or to your rules or have you watch me for what I'm doing, because I don't answer to you. I answer to God. This carries to logical extremes, this idea, doctrine of predestination, which means that when we're born, like, God has destined us for heaven or hell. So because she's preaching dangerous ideas too that run counter to the ideas of the Puritan life in Massachusetts, she also gets kicked out to where? Rhode freaking Island. Later, sad enough, she's killed in a Native American attack in New York. And John Winthrop, our City on a Hill friend, says, see, this is God's doing. God sent the natives to kill her because she was preaching dangerous ideas. So that just goes to show you what this ideology of the City on a Hill really looks like in practice in Massachusetts. Crazy. Notably, we talked about the Powhatan uprisings in Virginia. We'll talk about the Pequot Wars here in Massachusetts. They take place about 16 years in. Pequot Wars of 1636, 1637. If you remember, same thing I told you in Virginia, as more people come, the colony gets more successful. As the colony gets more successful, the colony spreads out. As the colony spreads out, you end up running into native conflict because they're like, whoa, don't like this idea. Now, the Pequot tribe, like the Powhatan tribe, are a very, very powerful Native American tribe. In this case, they're in the Connecticut River Valley, which is here. We see, of course, who starts this war? White people start this war. Whites, with their Indian allies, are going to attack Pequot villages on the Mystic River. They're going to set homes on fire and shoot fleeing survivors. And the Pequot tribe, in this first series of Pequot Wars, is virtually annihilated. So for the next 40 years, we see this uneasy peace because the natives that are in conflict with the white settlers aren't strong enough to push back because of disease and these wars that kill so many of their people. 40 years later, we see the last uprising of Native Americans in the New England region, and that's with King Philip's or Metacomet's War. He's called King Philip he's a Native American chief. He's called King Philip by the white people. He's called Metacomet or Metacome by his people. And 40 years after the Pequot War, his argument is the only hope for Native Americans, as more and more and more white people are showing up and their society is getting more and more and more stable and more spread out. The only hope Native Americans have is to unite, which means my tribe and your tribe and your tribe and your tribe. Maybe we haven't been friends for the last 400 years, but we need to be friends now because we need to unite against white expansion. If white expansion keeps pitting Native American tribes against each other, only group that loses is Native American tribes, because eventually it's going to be you that they come for. It's your territory they're going to want. So Metacomet, they united the Indians, a whole bunch of tribes, and they staged coordinated attacks on white settlements throughout New England at the same time, day, all together coordinating attacks on white settlements. Those settlements who are out in outcroppings farther from Boston are forced to retreat back into the city of Boston for safety. It's a very successful short-term attack by the Native Americans, but the war, like most of these wars, is going to be short-term successful, long-term failure for the Native Americans. The war is going to end in failure for the Indians. Medicomet is they cut his head off and they draw and quarter him, which means cut him open and stretch him out and hang him in front of the town to remind the rest of the Native Americans what happens if you try to have an uprising. The white settlers sell his son and his wife into slavery, and Native Americans are never again a serious threat in New England. So 50 years post Mayflower, Native Americans are virtually wiped out as a resistance threat in New England, which is another reason why the New England settlement is so successful, because they don't have the threat of Native American attack. This is what he looks like. And again, it's just a reminder that these people that are coming to Massachusetts aren't there to practice freedom of religion, because if they were practicing freedom of religion, they wouldn't be doing things like kicking out Roger Williams, kicking out Anheuser. They're not there even to practice the true teachings of God, because that would then require them to not be selling people into slavery and killing Native Americans like this. But they're there to create their own perfect religious utopia that follows their vision, their version of Protestant Christianity. So that's the New England settlement. With things we should know. The last thing I have to talk to you about is the middle colonies, which are going to kind of take some elements of Northern and Southern society and merge it into their own. We're going to see their big economic industry is twofold. Shipbuilding and commerce and trade. They're going to have the big successful seaports or commercial centers, the big cities that are going to be exporting a lot of goods. Those are New York and Philadelphia, which are very, very important to note for this story. So they're going to see the most trade and commerce, meaning goods coming in and out of the cities there in the middle colonies. And then inland, we're going to see a whole bunch of small-scale farming, not cash crop farming. This is very different. Not cash crop farming, because they're not farms that are producing a cash crop, but instead bread basket farms, which means they're farming the goods that feed people, that create bread, that people can live off of. Mostly wheat and corn. Okay, so the middle colonies are referred to as the bread basket because they're the places where they're farming the foods people can eat, and they're also going to have the biggest cities because they have the ability to ship things in and out, which attracts more settlers in and out. So New York and Philadelphia are good to know. The bread basket idea is good to know. I had this last year in class, actually both last year, quite hilarious, on a test question. Told me that the middle colonies are farming bread baskets. No, they're called the bread basket colonies because they're farming the type of things people eat, wheat and corn. Okay. Eventually, the middle colonies are going to transition later to much more heavy emphasis on manufacturing and trade, but we'll save that for a later date. Now, the one colony that's unique, I think, in the middle colonies you should know is Pennsylvania. It is, of course, founded by Quakers. If you ever get oatmeal, William Penn, the Quakers, you'll see the Quaker man on the front of the oatmeal. It's pretty cool. And William Penn establishes Pennsylvania as a holy experiment, an attempt to create a society built on toleration, on protection of all classes of people, on equality, on the practices of Quakerism. Now, Quakers, of course, first settled in New England. And what happened in New England? They were kicked out because they weren't the perfect type of Puritan Christians that everybody else wanted to be. So these Quakers are another example of my point about New England, which means that they're not there for religious freedom. They're there for freedom of their religion. Very big difference. So in 1681, they form Pennsylvania, a society founded on Quaker principles that promotes religious toleration and protection of all. It's the one colony that is known for compensating Native Americans for the land that they settle on. And because of that, they're going to appeal to a way more diverse population because they're established on toleration. English immigrants, Welsh immigrants, Irish immigrants, German immigrants. We're going to see way more diversity in the middle colonies for those two reasons. Reason one, toleration. Reason two, that's where the commerce is happening, which means that's where people are coming on ships, because with commerce comes people and the like. So because of that, Pennsylvania has a very ethnically, nationally, and religiously diverse population. But because of diversity, we see much more quarrel, much more conflict, right? Because Virginia is very homogeneous, meaning they're all the same. They're all Protestant Church of England followers, Anglican Church, whereas Massachusetts is all mostly Puritan. Because Pennsylvania is diverse, that diversity leads to conflict. But despite the conflict, Pennsylvania becomes much, much more successful, much, much more prosperous. 1701, William Penn actually gives even self-rule to those Pennsylvania colonists to rule themselves, right, without having like a royal governor anymore, but just to do things their own way. And the small counties that have spread out, they get their own colony of Delaware as well. So that's Pennsylvania. It's kind of a unique part of the story. I'm just curious. Feel free to send me a message on remind of these colonies. Where would you like to live? Me personally, I'd like to live in Pennsylvania or Rhode Island because they're the ideas that are more tolerant of ideas. I like diversity. I don't like homogeneity. Curious, where would you find yourself being successful here in these early colonies? But from a conclusion standpoint, every one of these colonies has significant early struggles to survive. It's not easy. Right. These regional differences that what the South is about, what New England's about, what the middle colonies are about, these distinct differences are only going to intensify, which means the South's going to get more Southern, right? The New England's going to get more New Englandish, and it's not until much later that we start identifying ourselves not as Virginians or Pennsylvanians, but as quote unquote Americans. But that is a story for another day. I hope this was helpful. If you want any clarification on any of these questions, feel free to shoot me a message, and I'll be happy to get that to you. Have a great day.